الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So today we'll continue talking about the ahkam of menstruation. So the next thing to talk about is the longest amount of menstruation. So last time we talked about the shortest amount, and we said that the strongest opinion was that of Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, that they said there's no minimum. So now we're talking about the maximum. So there's a number of opinions on this topic again. So the first opinion is that it's 15 days would be the maximum. So anything beyond this would be considered it would be considered prolonged blood flow, and it wouldn't be considered menstruation, and then it wouldn't take any of the ahkam of this. And that's the opinion of the Mâlikiyyah, the Shâfi'iyyah, and the Hanâbilah. So they use a hadith, but there's no basis for it even. It's mentioned in the books of fiqh, but really there's no chain for it. It's not found in any of the books of a hadith. And it's the famous hadith, the default or the asl of it is in Bukhari and Muslim, but here it states, or that the Prophet ﷺ said, one of them will remain half of their life not praying, so meaning speaking about women. So in the hadith, the authentic narration of the hadith mentions that the Prophet ﷺ explained that the women will have a lower level of deen, and then they said, well, what could it be, or what was the reason? And then the Prophet ﷺ said, isn't it that if they menstruate that they don't pray and they don't fast? So this is the authentic narration of the hadith, but there's this other made up essentially part of the hadith, or that they attributed to the hadith, that says that one of them would remain half of their life not praying. So meaning that half of the time they're praying and half of the time they aren't praying. So if we look at the month is either 29 or 30 days. So if we say that it's 30, half of their life they're not praying, 15 days, so they say that this would be the maximum. Again, there's no basis for this hadith, and that was mentioned by al-Bayhaqi, Ibn al-Jawzi, Ibn Hajar, Ibn Mandah, al-Mundhiri, and al-Nawawi, and others all said that there's no basis for this hadith. They also mentioned some statements of the tabi'een and some of the ulama that came after, such as Ata and al-Hasan al-Basri and Ubaydullah ibn Umar and others. But again, they would say that the most a woman ever has menstruated was 15 days. Again, this isn't evidence, it's a statement of not even a Sahabi, it's from the Tabi'een and those after. And also, it just says that this was the most that was ever seen. So if, that it wouldn't prove anything, because if it happened to be longer, then the whole thing would fall apart. They also say that if a person had the time longer than this, then in a month, it would be longer that they were in menstruation than if they were out of menstruation. And then they say that more than half, when we talked about this before, there's sometimes in the Sharia when if something is more than half, it takes the same ruling as the whole. So they say that essentially this person would always be in menstruation. And again, this is baseless, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it would be 15 and 15. It could be 15 and then 30, and then we would say, well, now it's gone out of the month, so it wouldn't really make any sense. And also, we wouldn't say that it takes the ruling of the whole, because we have two separate things. So we have a time when they're menstruating and a time when they're not menstruating. So this is the argument, and as you see, the majority take this, but really there's no textual evidence for it. The second opinion is that it's 10 days, and that's the opinion of the Ahnâf. And for this, they mention a number of arguments. The first one, all of the ahadith on it are extremely weak, but one of the things that they mention is that a narration from Anas ibn Mâlik, that it's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ that he said, "Al-haydu thalathatu ayyam wa arba'atu wa khamsa wa sitta wa sab'a wa thamaniya wa tis'a فَإِذَا جَاوَزَتِ الْعَشْرَةِ فَهِيَ مُسْتَحَاضَةٌ. Or that they say that the Prophet ﷺ said, menstruation is 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 days. And if it goes more than 10, then it's prolonged blood flow or istihada. And this was narrated by Ibn Adi in al-Kamil fi Du'afa al-Rijal. But it's extremely weak. It contains a narrator named al-Hasan ibn Dinar, and he's matruk al-hadith. And then they also mention other similar narrations that are extremely weak as well. One that says أقل الحيض ثلاث وأكثره عشر, or that the least menstruation is 3 and the most is 10. And again, we talked about this last time, I think, when we talked about the minimum menstruation. And then they mention a third narration that's similar to this. And again, there's nothing authentic on the topic. And you can go back to the other recordings for the defects in those hadith. The next opinion is that it's 7 days. So the maximum it would go is 7. And that's a narration from Imâm Ahmad, and it was the opinion of Ibn Hazm. So what they say is that there's a consensus that anything more than this isn't hayd, or isn't menstruation. And then they also say that that there's narrations that never went beyond 7, that no one was ever found to have more than 7. What would we say to this though?
That it could have occurred, but it wasn't reported.
Right, and the other people said, well, no, the maximum was 15 because that was the most that was ever found. So you have other people saying, well, no, more was even found. So this shows the weakness in saying, well, this was found and this wasn't found, because we don't know what all of the people, what they've all said and things like that. So this is the argument that they make. And then the last opinion is that there's no limit. And that's the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah. So what he used for this, and all those who held his opinion, was that in the Sharia we have specific ahkam, or we have specific signs that tell us if it's menstruation or not. If those are present, it doesn't really matter the limit, and if they're not present, then it doesn't matter the time as well. And Allahu A'lam, this is the stronger opinion as well, just like we talked about last time, that the minimum has no limit and the maximum has no limit either, because of the same arguments. Because if nothing was specified in the Sharia with a limit, then we can't attribute a limit to it, and we don't really need to go beyond that. So that's the opinion, or that's the issue on the longest amount of menstruation. Next, we'll talk about the periods of purity between the two. So between the two menstruations, what's the longest and the shortest amounts of time that a person would be pure? And again, we'll go over it quite quickly. So the first opinion is that it's 15 days. So the shortest amount of time that could be between the two menstruations is 15 days. And that's the opinion, again, of the majority, the Ahnâf, the Mâlikiyyah, the Shâfi'iyyah, and a narration from Imâm Ahmad. Again, they mention the same hadith, which has no basis, that a person would stay half of their life not praying. And we just talked about this anyway. Also, they say that every month generally includes a menstruation and a time of purity. If the person, and since we've proven that the maximum is 15 days for the menstruation, then that leaves 15 days for the purity as well. So what would we say to that? So they say that we've proven that the maximum amount of the menstruation could be is 15 days. So if we've proven that, then this only leaves 15 days left in the month. So this would show that the shortest amount of purity between the two would be 15. Because there's only 15 left out of the 30. So what would we say to that?
Well, isn't 15 says the maximum days, so what if it's something shorter than that, right? Are you talking about the longest time period between the two menstruations?
The shortest.
Okay, that's right. Well, we'll see.
Are you saying that if it lasted 15 days, and the shortest period is 15 days, is that when they ended it, there would be a menstruation again already?
Well, so they're saying if we say the maximum a person can have a menstruation for is 15 days,
and
then
they're saying the minimum amount of purity is 15 days as well, right?
The minimum, because they say if we look at a month, it's 30 days. if 15 of that was taken by menstruation, then the least there could be for the purity would be another 15.
We haven't really proven, that's just opinion.
We haven't proven it, that's one thing. Another thing is, who says that it has to be exactly within 30-day period? What if it goes 20 days of menstruation, and then 25 days of purity, and then 20 days of menstruation and 25? Like, who says it has to be contained within this 30-day period in order to say, well, we only have 15 left, so we have to add it to that? Like, it's an arbitrary number to just say, well, most of the time it happens within a 30-day period, so it really only leaves us this much. It doesn't have to be like, what if everything was double? So say, for example, a woman had menstruation for 20 days and then 50 days without it, and then 20 days and then 50 days without it. Who's to say that because it's not within a 30-day period, that the whole thing is wrong now? There's no basis for it. So this is the first opinion. The second is that it's 13, so the minimum would be 13, and that's the main opinion of the Hanâbilah. Again, we don't need to go into all the details, but the hadith that they mention about it, it was narrated by al-Darimi, and it's a broken chain. It comes from Ali, and it was the same one that we talked about before, where a person came to Ali and said, or a woman came to complain to Ali or to seek judgment from Ali that she was divorced and then she had her 3 periods within a 1-month time frame, and she wanted for that divorce to be declared final. So they say that Ali radiallahu anhu gave the judgment or let the judgment be given by his companion. And then he judged that if someone could prove, or she could prove, that she had given up the salat 3 times in the month and made ghusl and so on, that this would be considered correct. So what they do is they say that if we look at the numbers of a 30-day period, and they go back to, okay, well, what's the minimum amount of menstruation? And then we add this and we do the math, they say that this would result in 13 days. Again, we said this hadith is weak. Plus, it was a judgment from, even if it was authentic, it was a judgment from tabi'i that was approved by a sahabi, so it wasn't wahy, and it was just happened to be this woman's case, so it doesn't really prove anything for anyone else. And also, we could divide the numbers in a different way. You could add the period is longer and the time would be shorter in between, and so on. So really, again, it doesn't prove anything whatsoever. The next is 19 days, and that's the opinion of some of the Ahnâf, and we don't need to go into that. Then 5 days, the opinion of some of the Mâlikiyyah. 8 days as well from Imâm Mâlik. 10 days from Imâm Mâlik. And all of these, the arguments for all of them, they say, well, this was what was shown through experience. So really, they all give the same argument. And last is that there's no limit. So it could be 30 days, it could be 50 days, it could be 100 days. It's just based on the person themselves. So we wouldn't say, well, because you've gone on past a certain number of days, even though you haven't received your menstruation, you have to be in menstruation now. It's impossible for us to say that, because again, the Sharia has put specific signs for things. If the signs are present, we judge with that, and if they're not present, then we don't judge. And again, that's the opinion of Ibn Taymiyyah. And textually, what he used is a hadith that we talked about before, from the one from Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh, that she came and asked the Prophet ﷺ about her prolonged blood flow, and the Prophet ﷺ told her to, if your days arrive, then leave the salat, and then if they go, then wash the blood off of you and pray. So he didn't specify a limit for anything, and he just gave her, or he let the judgment be done by her based upon her own custom. Next is the longest period of purity. So this is meaning that what's the longest amount of time that would be between the 2 periods? So we talked about the longest period, shortest period, shortest amount of purity, and now we're talking about the longest amount of purity. And again, on this issue, there's a consensus that there's no limit. So it could be, as we said, like Ibn Taymiyyah's opinion, it could be as short as possible, and it could be that there's no limit, or that it's, that we can't place a limit on what the longest amount of time is. And this consensus was mentioned by al-Kasani, who was from the Ahnâf in his book Badâ'i' as-Sanâ'i', and al-Nawawi in al-Majmû'. And all the madhahib say that there's no limit. So if a person, had 30 days or 50 or 70, all of them have accepted that this would be acceptable. So this is with regards to the timing. So next the author says, post-childbirth bleeding. So he says, such bleeding occurs after the birth of a child, regardless if the child survived the birth or not. This type of bleeding has no minimum duration, for it could stop right after the birth, or there could be even no blood. Therefore, her confinement would end and she would be obliged to fast, pray, and so on. The maximum duration is 40 days. And then he quotes a hadith from Salama radiallahu anha that she said, كانت النفساء تجلس على عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم 40 يوما. Or that she said, during the lifetime of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the women in childbirth or in post-childbirth bleeding would remain sitting, so meaning like they wouldn't pray or fast, for 40 days. And he says, related by the 5 except an-Nasa'i. So meaning Ahmad, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah, and Tirmidhi. So this hadith, it's actually weak for a number of reasons. The main reason that it's weak is the narrator, who's from Salama. Her name is Musa al-Azdiyah. She wasn't known, so she was unknown. So they can't, or the hadith isn't actually confirmed from Salama. However, the author then continues and he says, after recording the hadith, at-Tirmidhi says, the knowledgeable companions, the following generation, and those who came later, agree that a woman experiencing post-childbirth bleeding had to stop praying for 40 days unless her blood stopped. If her bleeding stops before that time, she is to make ghusl and start praying. If she sees blood after 40 days, most scholars say that she is not to stop praying. So meaning that he's saying that they would say that the maximum is 40 days. If it stops before, they would pray and fast. If it goes beyond that, then it wouldn't be considered post-childbirth bleeding, and it would be considered similar to someone who has a prolonged blood flow in their monthly period. So just to add a bit to this, so all of the ahkam related to nifas, or post-childbirth bleeding, are the same as menstruation. So anything that we applied or talked about, or we will talk about in menstruation, it also applies to nifas. There's nothing added and nothing taken away. The only difference is the timings. And this is a matter of consensus. And that was mentioned by Ibn Qudamah in al-Mughni, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi in al-Muhadhab, al-Qâdhî Abdul-Wahhab al-Baghdadi in al-Ma'una ala Madhhab Alim al-Madina, and Ibn Rajab in Fath al-Bari. He said that, and many scholars said that there was an ijma' on it. From them was Ibn Jarir al-Tabari and al-Nawawi in al-Majmû', and Taghlibi in Nail al-Ma'arib, and Ibn Hazm in al-Muhalla. So this is a matter that no one's disputed ever. It's widespread. Many of the ulama have declared that there's a consensus that all of the ahkam of menstruation apply to nifas and vice versa. So to talk about the minimum time frame of nifas, their first opinion is that there's no minimum. So it could be nothing, it could be one drop, it could be 1 day, it could be 5 days, there's no minimum. And that's the opinion of the majority. So the Ahnâf, the Mâlikiyyah, the Shâfi'iyyah, it's the famous or the main opinion of the Hanâbilah, and it was the opinion of Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah. So for this, a number of different arguments, depending on who is speaking. So they say that it's like menstruation. So this is, what Ibn Hazm and Ibn Taymiyyah would say, that there's no minimum. That, it could be nothing. or it could be one drop, or it could be whatever. Because if it's the same as menstruation, then the same guidelines should be applied as well. They also say that there's nothing authentic to state that there's a minimum, so we can't place a restriction. Then they mention a weak hadith from Ali, and then another one from Aisha. We don't need to go into it. And then they mention that there's a consensus, and they say what Tirmidhi mentioned about, that the author mentioned. So Tirmidhi said that when it came to the minimum, he didn't specify or say the majority, he just said that this was what was said. And then when he talked about the maximum, he talked about the difference of opinion. The next opinion is that it's 1 day is the least. And that's the opinion of, or a narration from Imâm Ahmad. There's no specific evidence. It could be that there was a qiyas upon menstruation, as we talked about before, that one of the narrations from him was that the minimum menstruation was 1 day. Next is that the least is 3, and that's the opinion of Sufyan al-Thawri, and a narration from Imâm Ahmad. Again, no specific evidence. It's possible that they made qiyas on menstruation. And the last opinion is that 4 days is the least, and that was the opinion of al-Muzani. And there's nothing clear on this topic either. He didn't mention anything clear. But Imam al-Ghazali, who was also a Shafi'i like al-Muzani, tried to argue and say that the reason for this is because the maximum nifas is 60 days, which is 4 times the maximum menstruation. So they said the maximum menstruation was 15 days. If we say the maximum nifas is 60 days, so we've had to multiply it by 4. Then they say, well, if we look then at the minimum, which was 1 day of menstruation, then we have to also multiply that by 4. What do we say about that, though?
Sorry, that's so confusing.
Well, really, so what they're saying, they're first of all, they're making a judgment on what's the maximum nifas. And they say it's 60. And again, we'll show that there's really no evidence for that. Then they say, so now they've made essentially an arbitrary judgment on the maximum. Then they say, we also know that the maximum menstruation is 15 days. So if we divide them, then it's by 4. It's 15 into 60 is 4. So now they've made already 2 arbitrary judgments. And then they say, well, then this shows that if we look at what's the minimum menstruation, which is 1 day, then we have to multiply it by 4. Yeah.
But isn't there ijma' that they're the exact same? Or the nifas follows the same rulings as the menstrual?
The same rulings, yeah, in the sense that whatever's forbidden is forbidden in this time. Whatever's, the rulings with regards to what you have to do.
Oh, not the timings?
Not the timings, no.
I
Yeah.
the timings.
So really, again, they're making an arbitrary judgment, and then they're making another one, and then they're basing them on each other, and then making a third. So really, there's nothing for it. And even further to this, when al-Muzani said that the minimum is 4, and then al-Ghazali tried to say, well, it was because of this other argument. Al-Muzani himself didn't even agree with that opinion, which was al-Ghazali was trying to use to reconcile. So that's kind of a side point. But the point is that we don't look at who says an opinion and try to show how it could be right or how they were arguing it, and say, well, this makes sense if we look at it this way. If it complies with the Quran and the Sunnah, we say it's correct. If it doesn't, we say it was an ijtihad, and we don't need to try to show how it's right, regardless of what madhab they are, regardless of who they were, regardless of how knowledgeable they were. We just disregard it and say, inshallah, they have reward for their ijtihad, but we don't need to follow it or even really come up with an explanation as to why they held that opinion. So with this, again, definitely the strongest opinion is that of the majority, that there's no minimum. So now to talk about the maximum. First opinion is that it's 40 days. And that's the opinion of the Ahnâf, and the main Hanbalî opinion, as well as Imam Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak and Ishaq ibn Rahuya. And so what they use is the same hadith that the author mentioned from Salama, that she said that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the women who were in post-childbirth bleeding used to stay for 40 days and not praying, like meaning that they would stay confined or stay sitting. So they use this. Again, we showed or we talked about that it's not authentic from her. But they also use another very similar narration from Ibn Abbas, that he said, تَنْتَظِرُ النُّفَسَاءُ نَحْوًا مِنْ 40 يَوْمًا, or that Yusuf ibn Mahak, he said that Abdullah ibn Abbas said that the women in post-childbirth bleeding wait for approximately 40 days. And that was narrated by Darimi in his Sunan and Ibn al-Jarud in al-Muntaqa. And then they also mention a number of other hadith that are weak or extremely weak. So what we have here is nothing from the Prophet ﷺ, but we have a slightly weak narration from Salama, and then another narration which Allahu Alam would be Hasan from Abdullah ibn Abbas, that he said it's about 40 days. The second is that it's 50 days. That's the opinion of Al-Hasan al-Basri. No evidence, just a statement from him that was the maximum. 60 days is the next opinion, and that's the main opinion of the Mâlikiyyah and the Shâfi'iyyah, and a narration from Imâm Ahmad. And this is based upon some of the, again, experiences. So they'll say, well, the maximum we ever saw was 60 days, so that's what we would go and go by, or that's what we would take into account. And they say that the maximum for menstruation is 7, or the norm, is 7, but most go over. So they say likewise, the norm for nifas is 40 days, but most go over. So it would be obligatory to add extra time. And then they make calculations that are based upon the average length of pregnancies and the average length of menstruation. So they say, well, if the average, if it's up to 10 months of a pregnancy, then they say, if we look at this and we look at how long a menstruation is and so on, and again, it's all just judgment. There's no text from the Quran or the Sunnah, and nothing really to back it up. 70 days is the next opinion, and that was mentioned by al-Layth ibn Sa'd, Imam al-Layth ibn Sa'd, and he said that this was, some people would say this. No evidence again. And then also another opinion is that it goes back to women for them to judge and the people of knowledge, and that was attributed to Imam Malik. And then they say because there's nothing in the Quran or the Sunnah to specify a limit, so we have to go back to people who know about these issues. So then we would look at women because it's something that they're dealing with, and the people of knowledge because they can judge in that argument or in that issue. And then they also say that because the Prophet ﷺ, there's some ahadith where he called menstruation nifas. So they say just as women have to judge how long something would be when they're with their menstruation, then since it was called menstrual or nifas in some hadith, then we would go back to the same thing. And again, there's some strength to this, but again, we have to say, well, is there a limit or not? And the last opinion is from Imam al-Awza'i, and he said 35 for a boy and 40 for a girl. Again, there's no argument for that. If makes no difference biologically, if a boy is born or a girl, it has no basis whatsoever. So with this, we would say without doubt, the strongest opinion is that it's 40 days, because even though there's no text from the Prophet ﷺ, there's some acceptable at some level narrations from the Sahaba saying that it would be 40 days, and this seems to be the opinion of the vast majority of the ulama as well. So this is the end of the timings with regards to all of the things in this chapter. So menstruation, maximum and minimum, nifas, maximum and minimum, and the purity or the times of purity, that it's the maximum and the minimum. Yeah.
But if a girl had nifas for 41 days, doesn't that disprove the whole argument?
It disproves it except for, we would say that it would be similar, or that that after that they can still be bleeding, but we would say that it's considered to be different than the bleeding that's due to the childbirth. So similar to like if a woman menstruated for, let's say her average was 8 days and then it went to say 9, 10, 11, we would say after the 8 days it's no longer menstruation. They have to pray and fast, but even if they're still bleeding, because it's not the same blood. So similar to this as well. So next the author says, forbidden acts for women experiencing menstruation and post-childbirth bleeding. So he says, all acts forbidden for a person who has not yet cleansed himself from janaba are prohibited to women in these two conditions, as they are considered major impurities, but there are also two further prohibitions. So he's saying anything that would be forbidden by janaba, which we talked about, alhamdulillah, in detail before, all of those things would be forbidden, plus two extra things, and then he's going to go into them. So he says, the first one, they cannot fast. If women fast, their fast will be considered null and void. If they fast the month of Ramadan, they would still have to make up those days of fasting later on. And then he quotes the hadith from Mu'adha that she said, سألت عائشة رضي الله عنها فقلت ما بال الحائض تقضي الصوم ولا تقضي الصلاة. Or she said to Aisha, why is it that a woman who has her menstruation, why is it that she makes up her fasting but not the prayer? So Aisha رضي الله عنها said, كان يصيبنا ذلك مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فنؤمر بقضاء الصوم ولا نؤمر بقضاء الصلاة. Or that she said, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, this used to happen to us, so meaning they would get their menstruation. So we would be told to, or commanded to make up our fast, and we wouldn't be commanded to make up our prayer. And he says related by the group, so al-Bukhari, Muslim, and the rest. And this is a matter of consensus. So Imam al-Nawawi and al-Qurtubi and others said that there's a matter of consensus that they can't fast. So no one has ever said that they have to fast. And some of the evidences for this is the same hadith from Mu'adha. But the full narration is that a woman asked Aisha. So Mu'adha said, a woman asked Aisha, أتجزي إحدانا صلاتها إذا طهرت? So that Aisha radiallahu anha said, should I offer the prayers that I didn't offer because of my menstruation? So meaning that if a woman has her menstruation and doesn't pray for those days, should she make up those salat later on? So Aisha radiallahu anha said to her, أحرورية أنت? Or are you a Haruriya? And the Haruriya were from the Khawarij at the time, because they started saying that certain things should be done what there wasn't evidence in the Quran or the Sunnah for. So they would say that the woman has to make up her fast or her prayer after her menstruation. And as we talked about before, they would, for the when we if we amputate the hand of a thief, they would say it has to be all the way up to the shoulder, and they would contradict things in the Quran or the Sunnah that were completely, or they would do things that were completely against the Quran and the Sunnah. So this was one of them, and it began even in the time of the Sahaba from the Khawarij. So then Aisha radiallahu anha continued and said, كنا نحيض مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فلا يأمرنا به أو قالت فلا نفعله. Or she said that we used to menstruate during the time of the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, and he wouldn't command us with it, or she said, and we wouldn't do it, so meaning we wouldn't make it up. And this was Imam al-Bukhari's phrasing himself. Also, if we look at the hadith that we talked about many times before, about where the Prophet ﷺ was giving the khutbah on one of the Eids, and then he went to the women and he said, يا معشر النساء تصدقنا فإني أريتكن أكثر أهل النار. Or the Prophet ﷺ said, O women, give in sadaqah because I've seen that you're the majority of the people of the fire. فَقُلْنَا وَبِمَا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Or they said, and what was that for, O Messenger of Allah? So he said, تُكْثِرْنَا اللَّعْنَ وَتَكْفُرْنَا الْعَشِيرِ. Or you do lots of cursing, so you make a la'an very often, and you are ungrateful to your husbands or those who take care of you. ما رأيت من ناقصات عقل ودين أذهب للب الرجل الحازم من إحداكن. Or then he said, or he continued and said, I have not seen anyone more deficient in their intellect or their religion than you. A cautious, sensible man could be led astray by some of you. Then the Prophet then they said, or they asked the Prophet ﷺ, or قُلْنَا وَمَا نُقْصَانُ دِينِنَا وَعَقْلِنَا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. They said, well, what is the reason, or what is the cause, or what is the deficiency in the intellect and the religion, O Messenger of Allah? So he said, أَلَيْسَ شَهَادَةُ الْمَرْأَةِ مِثْلُ نِصْفِ شَهَادَةِ الرَّجُلِ قُلْنَا بَلَى. Or he said, the Prophet ﷺ said, isn't it that the testimony from a woman is half of the testimony of a man? So they said, of course. قال فذلك or فذلك من نقصان عقلها, or that's the deficiency in the intellect. And then he continued and said, أليس إذا حاضت لم تصل ولم تصم قلنا بلى قال فذلك من نقصان دينها. Or then he said that, isn't it that if she menstruates, she doesn't pray or fast? And they said, of course, and he said, then that's the deficiency in the religion. So we see here a number of things. So it shows that, if we look at these ahadith, it shows that it's obligatory to leave the salat and the fasting. They can't do it. It also shows that the salat isn't made up, but the fasting is, and that this was the judgment from the Prophet ﷺ. And there's a consensus that it's obligatory upon the woman to make up the fasts that she left during her menstruation. And that was mentioned by Ibn al-Mundhir in al-Awsat. So this is a quick explanation or a quick discussion on first of all, the forbiddance or of fasting and praying, or the obligation of leaving them during the menstruation, as well as the obligation of making it up, and that most of these things there's a consensus on all of them. So just to add a little bit to this, so if a woman becomes tahir in the day, does she have to stop eating for the rest of the day? So let's say the woman is menstruating and then she sees that she's tahir after dhuhr. Do we say that now that because she's not menstruating, she should be fasting, so for the rest of the day she has to give up eating and drinking? Or do we say that because it's invalid, because they weren't fasting for the whole day, that they don't have to withhold because there's no point to it? So on this, the first opinion is that she has to withhold, and it's obligatory upon her to make it up. So for the rest of the day she can't eat or drink, just like if she was fasting, but she also has to make up that fast because obviously it wasn't valid. And that's the opinion of the Ahnâf and the main opinion of the Hanâbilah. So what they say is that if it took place before Fajr, so let's say it was, Fajr was at 6 o'clock and they became tahir at 5:30, they say that she would have to stay or refrain from eating and drinking for the rest of the day. So likewise, if it happens in the middle of the day, she should have to remain or to stay away from the fasting for the rest of the day as well. So this is the first argument that they make. And likewise they say, if we had evidence that the moon was sighted at night, and it comes to you in the day, that you would have to withhold from eating for the rest of the day. So for example, like if we looked for the moon on, say, Friday night, and then we couldn't find it, and then Saturday we're eating because Ramadan hasn't started, and then someone comes and says, and he's a trustworthy, says, no, I saw the moon last night, we would have to say, well, this is Ramadan, we're not allowed, we should have been fasting, but because we didn't have the information, we stop eating right now for the rest of the day. So this is the argument that they make. And they say she was only allowed to break her fast because she was menstruating. Now she's not menstruating, she's no longer allowed to withhold, to eat and drink. They also say that withholding from eating and drinking, it's a haqq or a right for the time. So meaning it's out of respect for the time. We shouldn't be eating and drinking during the day in Ramadan, so because of this, she shouldn't have to do so. And then they also make qiyas on the salat, and they say that if a woman became pure towards the end or in the middle of dhuhr time, we don't say that dhuhr isn't on her, but we would say that she has to pray dhuhr. And then they say also that if she continued to eat and drink, people would make accusations because she had no excuse to be eating because she wasn't menstruating. So meaning that if people saw her praying but she was eating at the same time, they would say, well, why is she praying if why is she eating if she's praying? That means she should be fasting as well. So this is the arguments that they make. The second opinion is that she doesn't have to stop eating. The rest of the day, she can continue to eat and drink, and there's no harm on her to do so. And that's the opinion of the Mâlikiyyah, the Shâfi'iyyah, some of the Hanâbilah, and Imâm ibn Hazm. So what they mention for this is a narration from Ibn Mas'ud that he said, "Man akala awwal an-nahar falyakul akhirah." Or whoever ate at the beginning of the day, then let him eat at the end of the day. Meaning that because you weren't fasting in the beginning of the day, that's essentially meaning that it's not an accepted fast because you didn't fast the whole day. So whoever's been eating in the beginning, he might as well eat at the end. And that's and that's narrated by Ibn Abi Shaybah. Also, they say that fasting one day is an act of worship. So having one part invalid invalidates the whole. So we would say that we don't have anything in the Sharia where if you fast from Fajr to Maghrib, you get the full reward. And if you fast from Fajr to Dhuhr, you get part of the reward. Or if you fasted from Dhuhr to Asr, you get part of the reward. And it's not something where you can pick part of it and say, well, there's either the whole thing or parts of it and all of them are valid. No, we say either the whole thing or nothing. There's nothing in between. And then they say that fasting is withholding from eating from Fajr till Maghrib with the intention. So the definition of fasting is that you're not eating or drinking or having intercourse from Fajr until Maghrib. So if you've eaten and you've ate and drank for the first part, it's not fasting anymore. You're just not eating. So it's not even an act of worship in the Sharia. And then they say that even the ones who say you can't eat, they say the fast is invalid. They don't say it counts for anything. So they're obligating somebody on something that has no result or with no evidence. And then the last opinion is that it's recommended for her to hide her eating. So meaning that it's allowed for her, but she should, or it's better to hide it. And that's the opinion of some of the Shâfi'iyyah. So if you look at all of this, what seems to be the strongest opinion? Second one. How about it?
Why do they say she should hide her eating?
So similar to the first argument when they say for two reasons. One, to prevent accusations. Because if people see you eating, even though there's, most likely a valid reason you're eating. You could be sick, you could have been traveling and come back, you could be finish your menstruation, you could be in your menstruation, but if you hide it, then it stops any of those accusations. And then, someone could also say because, it could make it harder on other people as well. So, you think so? But why should they hide if they're not doing anything wrong though?
Just so there's no fitna,
So would you say if a man is sick, should he hide his eating too?
Yeah.
How come though?
Maybe he was one of the other people that are fasting to see somebody eat.
Could be, yeah. So we would say that it's better, not because it has anything to do with the fasting, but because you shouldn't harm other people or make things hard. if someone said it from that point of view, then yeah, we would say. But if someone said because you weren't fasting in the beginning of the day and now you're, or you were menstruating in the beginning and now you're not, so it's better for you to hide because of that, we would say really there's no tie between the two. But if you're doing it to not make things hard on other people, you don't want to be eating in front of them, you don't want to make a hardship on them, then there would probably be no problem with that. So inshallah we'll stop there. Next time, we'll probably finish next time. If not, then the time after. So we'll talk about some more of the things that aren't allowed for the person who is menstruating. And then we'll talk about some of the ahkam related to prolonged blood flow. So inshallah we'll stop there for today. Wallahu a'lam.